Hi everyone. Today we're going to be talking about collecting data. And so we have gone past or gotten through the program evaluation stuff, and now we're again switching gears just a little bit and refocusing some attention on research and things that directly deal with research, but a lot of this stuff kind of filters into program evaluation as well, especially when we're thinking about collecting data, if we're collecting data for a needs assessment or if we're collecting data after a program has been put into place. We want to figure out how effective it might have been or if it worked or not. So data collection can occur with program evaluation and with research, but certainly this chapter especially kind of took the stance of a more research-oriented chapter. So nonetheless, so let's kind of get into it. So when we're thinking about scales of measurement, basically when we're thinking about collecting data, what we do is we get information from people, right? And that information comes from surveys and observations. We're not getting numbers from people. What we need to transpose things into some type of numerical value so that we can input information into a statistical analysis program and it can spit out what our results are, so then we can make inferences from the data that we've collected. And so really we're assigning numbers to different types of characteristics when we're thinking about measurement, and we do this for coding purposes. What's interesting in the field of psychology and counseling, social work, the humanities, is that the instrumentation that we're using, it's not always completely standardized, or at least to the degree that somebody in like a hard science program would want or hope that their instrumentation would be for testing. It may not be as precise as we hope. We're dealing with thoughts and feelings and emotions, expression. If we're observing somebody, then we have to always take into account researcher bias. And there's a lot of objectivity in measurement, right? So what somebody might be feeling tomorrow is not what they were feeling today necessarily. And so that's something that researchers in the field of counseling, have always had to deal with. And we have to be aware and acknowledge those limitations whenever we are publishing materials or putting information out. So it doesn't mean that the studies that are done that come from a psychological background are useless, but it's just that we have to acknowledge the limitations. When we're thinking about scales of measurement, we're looking at discrete scales or continuous scales. Discrete scales are, where you're just belonging to one particular category. You're not belonging to more than one category at any given time. There's no room for disagreement. A person either is selection A or is selection B. The text gives the standard male-female as an example of a discrete scale. I mean, I think, depending on what your beliefs are and, what your knowledge is around gender, that could be left up for some argument. I would say some room for disagreement there, I suppose. But discrete scales, like a political affiliation, for example, generally you have to check that box, before election season to tell, the higher ups or whoever they may be what our political affiliation is. So that's an example of a discrete scale. Continuous scales, though they measure variables that can be divided out further. And so a lot of the psychological constructs that we use and that we have in counseling field and research end up being parts of the continuous scale because it's an approximation. Like I said, we're thinking about thoughts and feelings, and so it may be that somebody can't fit into the, depressed versus not depressed category. It's not necessarily one or the other. Somebody may be in the middle, and our scales often reflect that. So there are these 4 general types of scales. We're kind of going back to like Statistics 101 here. The best way to remember them is NOIR, the nominal scales, ordinal, interval, and ratio. Nominal, that's basically kind of the demographic sections of surveys. We use nominal scales to classify or characterize client characteristics, male, female, age groups potentially, backgrounds, ethnic groups, political parties, like the slide says. Ordinal scales, they are categorical choices that fall in an ordered sequence. So ordinal ordered sequence or ranking. Likert type scales you're going to see in a lot of counseling research, and so survey items will often include ordinal scales that are very useful. Interval scales, so if you're kind of thinking about the 4 different types of scales, interval and ratio are pretty closely related, except the difference is that ratio scales have an absolute 0, interval scales do not have an absolute 0. So if you're thinking about an interval scale, the difference between observational units is equal. So, and there's no absolute 0. So for example, with IQ scores, nobody has an IQ score of 0, but we're not saying, obviously, that somebody that has an IQ of 75 or 150 is twice as more intelligent as somebody that has an IQ of 75. So with ratio scales, there is a true 0 point. If we're looking at height and weight and money and age, you can't have an absolute 0 within those categories. And it's a very detailed type of scale. We're thinking about comparing the 4 different types of scales. So what comes after when the data collection process, basically what you've done is you've selected your participant group, you've done some sampling, and I encourage you to go back and review Chapter 7, Module 9 to think about the different sampling strategies. And so you've got your sample population, you are developing an instrument, or maybe you're using an instrument that's already out there for use, or you're modifying an instrument slightly. And if you're constructing an instrument, like a lot of us do in research, because something isn't out there to measure what we're hoping to measure, there are a number of different types of question types that we could ask in the development of a survey, for example. And so it just depends on what you're hoping to get out of your research, and the purpose of the question, and how you would like or hope for somebody to select an answer. Like I said, the Likert type and the Gutman type are very common types of questions within survey construction in the field of counseling. Those are ones that you would see, I would say, pretty regularly or pretty frequently. And then if we're thinking, I'm going to skip over the sampling strategies because we've gone through that before, but so if you're thinking about participant recruitment, there's a lot of things that a researcher would have to think about when considering participants and how to get participants in the door. And I think this is one area where, we would all hope that it's easy to get people to take our surveys. But, I myself even get inundated with surveys on a daily basis from people trying to complete, dissertations or like a master's thesis. And so people tend to just kind of ignore them. It can be very difficult to get participants recruited to complete your survey. Within qualitative research, you typically want like a smaller sample size, and so it can be potentially a little bit easier. But in quantitative research, we like to have a lot of numbers, and for certain statistical analyses, you need to have a good sample size, or the information that you get from the data you've collected really isn't useful. It's not beneficial. And so there are a lot of things you'd have to consider if you're going to start a research project. For one is, if you're looking at a site, do you have access to that site? Do you have to be physically present there with the person? Or can you just simply email or send paper copies of a survey? Do you need permission from, if you're going into, let's say, an agency setting, if you're going into a counseling agency setting and surveying all the counselors that work there, do you need permission from the administration before you go in and do that? Of course, we would always need permission from the participants themselves, but in some situations you may need permission for more than just the participants. You have to think about who should be contacted first. It may not be that you're contacting the group of participants that you hope to recruit. It may be that you're contacting their supervisors. If I'm doing a study on second-year counseling students, and I don't want to do it on my own class, and I want to do it on somebody else's class, well, the first people I'm not going to contact are the students. I'm going to go to the instructor or the head of the department and say, this is what I'm interested in doing. Can I get a green light to do that? You want to make sure that you've got a good idea of how long your survey or your questionnaire will be available. You don't want it out there forever, obviously, because that will extend the length of your research time. But you don't want to just put a survey out there and leave it there for a week and say that I'm not going to do it again. So typically, if somebody's doing research and they're pushing out a survey via email and listservs and social media and whatnot, usually it'll be pushed out at least 2, if not 3 times, so that people can get the sample size that they are needing to get in order to conduct the analysis. You also have to be considerate of how you will notify participants of their rights, how you'll get the informed consent. With a lot of the online survey options like Qualtrics, SurveyMonkey, all of that stuff can be uploaded within your survey itself. And so the first thing your participant is going to do is read their rights and have the informed consent in front of them. And they can either agree or disagree to continue, and then they can start the survey from there. So all of that is really nicely built into a lot of the survey instruments that are out there and available for free right now. But when it comes to technology and technology considerations, accessibility is certainly something to consider, particularly if we're thinking about rehabilitation counseling research and doing research on clients. So we want to be mindful of accessibility issues. If we are pushing out a survey, we want to make sure that if people are maybe going to be looking at it on their phones, that it would open up in the same way that it would on a computer screen, so that if you've got a Likert type survey that goes from, one being completely or disagree to 5 being completely agree, you want to make sure that the person is seeing all the options and not just numbers 1, 2, 3, and maybe 4. Certainly that would skew your results. And of course, is there an incentive? Incentives help, and when we think about writing to an REHB and including this type of information within an REHB application, we might need to actually touch on incentives, and incentives can help get the numbers up, basically. But we need to make participants aware of what the incentive might be, and then, of course, we're keeping information confidential. At some point, if we're offering an incentive, we are getting a little bit deeper into who's getting the incentive. If we're saying, you might be selected, 1 person out of every 200 will get a $50 Amazon card. Well, you would eventually know at least 1 person's name so that you can get that information out to them. We've gone through, I think, a lot of the different methods of collecting data. I mean, we've certainly talked about interviews and the different forms of interviews, focus groups, observations. Program records is one that comes up within program evaluation specifically. And, it may be that if I were doing a program evaluation of a counseling agency and a program that they've implemented recently, what I might do is just go back and see, or if they've had the program there for a couple of years, I might go back and take a look at the records to see how well the program was structured and how well it has been going, if people were meeting the goals that they had set for themselves or clients or whatever it might be. So program records are a nice, easy way to get a lot of data and information within a program evaluation. Excuse me. So obviously there's the standardized or counselor/researcher made tests, things that people develop on their own, performance indicators, products, and portfolios. Again, all of those could be really useful in a program evaluation type setting where you might be looking over clients or counselors' performance reports, maybe their annual reviews to see how well people are doing. And so you can do all of that without actually having to expect the participant to do something, which is nice. Participants don't always want to participate. So if you can get information from other areas to inform your program evaluation, it can be really useful. So with that, I'm going to leave you guys to the rest of the module. And certainly if you have any questions and as far as it goes with the first part of the needs assessment in the project, I'm going to be giving a lot of feedback on that, so please bear with me as I get through all of them after they're submitted, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have as we go along for it, okay? And I'll talk to you all later.